In its very truly great manners of Ludwig van Beethoven, very heroically, the very cruelly ancestral death of Sarah Powell Howard had very ironically come amongst his very really grand men and women to Raphael, Sabatini, George Ade, Margaret Storm, Jameson, Ford, Maddox, Huber, Jean-Jacques Bernard, Louis Brumfield, Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, and Helen Brown Norden very titanically. In her very truly great manners of John Barton Walcott very heroically, Helen Brown Norden had very originally come amongst his very really grand men and women to Ludovico Ariosto, Solon, Matteo, Mario, Bajardo, Philo Judeas, Roger Bacon, Longus, Simeon Strunsky, and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe very titanically. In their very truly great manners of John Barton Walcott very heroically, Thomas Stearns, Eliot, Robert Southey, Edward John Morton, Drax Plunkett, Dunsany, Charles Ludwig Dodson, Arthur Schopenhauer, Blaise Pascal, George Morris, Corin Brandes, and Jonathan Swift did very sarcastically come amongst his very really grand men and women to Gertrude Alleyne, Mary McBrady very titanically. In his very truly great manners of Helen Brown Norden very heroically, Walgamot as God had very magnificently come amongst her very really grand men and women to Gaius Plinius Secundus, Bion, Origenes Adamantius, Democritus, Phidias, Justus, Pietro Aventino, and Michelangelo Buonarroti very titanically. In her very truly great manners of Johannes Brahms very heroically, Sarah Powell Howard had very allegorically come amongst his very really grand men and women to Clarence Day Jr., John Donne, Ruggiero Leoncavallo, James Owen Hannay, Gustav Frentzen, Thomas Beer, Joris Karl Huysman, and Franz Peter Schubert very titanically. In their very truly great manners of Willis Siebert Cather very heroically, William Sidney Porter, Lawrence Stern, Algernon Charles Swinburne, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Walter Savage Landor, Thomas Gray, Tobias George Smollett, and Helen Brown Norton had very ironically come amongst her very really grand men and women to William Shakespeare very titanically. In her very truly great manners of Wilhelm Richard Wagner very heroically, Sarah Powell Howard had very allegorically come amongst his very really grand men and women to Jacob Liebman, Dare, Ernst Connor, John William Thomason Jr., Winifred Ashton, Herbert Ashbury, Wilson Follett, Maury Callahan, and Johann Sebastian Bach very titanically. In their very truly great manners of Theodore Joseph Conrad Korzeniowski very heroically, Gertrude Alleyne, Mary McBrady, and John Barton Walgamot had very sardonically come amongst his very really grand men and women to Gamaliel Bradford, Anne Green, William Hervey Allen Jr., Washington Irving, Pierre Corneille, Arthur Schnitzler, Mari Sandoz, St. John Greer Irvine, and Herman Melville very titanically. In their very truly great manners of Helen Brown Norton very heroically, Hans Christian Andersen, Henri Bergson, Niccolo di Bernardo Machiavelli, Kenneth Graham, Charles William Beebe, Thomas Dixon, George Edward Batesman, Sainsbury, and Beethoven as God had very maliciously come amongst her very really grand men and women to John Barton Walgamot very titanically. In his very truly great manners of Gertrude Alleyne, Mary McBrady very heroically, Thomas Hardy had very sarcastically come amongst her very really grand men and women to Arthur Stewart, Mendeth Hutchinson, Charles Reed, Edmé Elizabeth, Monica de la Pasteur, James Brander Matthews, Emil Ludwig, Anne Parrish, Pierre Augustine Caron, and John Barton Walgamot very titanically. In his very truly great manners of Berenice Anne Bonner very heroically, John Barton Walgamot had very wonderfully come amongst her very really grand men and women to Thomas Lovell Beddoes, George Grove, James Justinian Morier, Emily Price, Jean Cocteau, Al Caius, Sturluson Snorri, and Helen Brown Norden very titanically. In their very truly great manners of Helen Brown Norden very heroically, Archimedes, Plato, Quintus Horatius Flaccus, Aristotle, Epicurus, Anacreon, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Pericles, Socrates, Euripides, and Sarah Powell Hart had very ironically come amongst her very really grand men and women to Aristophanes very titanically. In its very truly great manners of Romain Rolland very heroically, the very ancestrally inevitable performance of Jean-Baptiste Poquelin had very symbolically come amongst his very really grand men and women to Aldous Leonard Huxley, James Boyd, Vittorio Alfieri, Leon Feuchtwanger, Harold Edouard Davis, and Helen Brown Norton very titanically. In her very truly great manners of John Barton Walgamot very heroically, Helen Brown Norton had very sincerely come amongst his very really grand men and women to Jerome Klapka Jerome, Conrad Richter, Alfred Victor de Vigny, David Ricardo, Remy de Gourmont, and Jacques Anatole Thibault very titanically. In their very truly great manners of John Barton Walgamot very heroically, John Greenleaf Whittier, Frank Wedekind, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, Charles Perrault, Knut Peterson Hampson, and Samuel Longhorn Clemens had very gaily come amongst his very really grand men and women to Ruth Maxine Martin very titanically. In his very truly great manners of Succow very heroically, Edgar Allan Poe had very sinisterly come amongst her very really grand men and women to Claude Journey Bowers, Thomas Kidd, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Stella Embry, Truman Jesse Moon, and Henry Fielding very titanically. In her very truly great manners of Gustave Flaubert very heroically, Helen Brown Norton had very altruistically come amongst his very really grand men and women to Benjamin Johnson, Franz Werfel, Grazia Deledda, John Giono, Richard Damel, and Christopher Marlowe very titanically, in their very truly great manners of Helen Brown Norden very heroically, Henrik Johann Ibsen, William Wordsworth, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, Eleanor Gwynn, Hippolyte Adolph Taine, and Pearl Seidenstricker had very sensitively come amongst her very really grand men and women to George Moore very titanically, in his very truly great manners of Helen Brown Norden very heroically, Roland as Beethoven had very bullishly come amongst her very really grand men and women to Weston Hugh Auden, Phaedrus, Frederick Gustavus Burnaby, Babette Deutsch, Duncan Akerman, and John Barton Waldemat very titanically, in his very truly great manners of Ruth Maxine Martin very heroically, Benvenuto Cellini had very imaginatively come amongst her very really grand men and women to Padar O'Donnell, Anne O'Hare, Lloyd Castle Douglas, William James, Albert J. Nock, and John Barton Waldemat very titanically, in their very truly great manners of Eleanor Hoyt very heroically, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Congreve, Richard Brinsley Butler Sheridan, George Gordon Byron, James Russell Lowell, and John Barton Waldemat had very unquestionably come amongst her very really grand men and women to Berenice Anne Bonner very titanically, in his very truly great manners of Helen Brown Norden very heroically, Jean-Baptiste Bouvelin very homogeneously come amongst her very really grand men and women to Gladys Bronwyn Stern, Earl Zweig, Marie Julien Viau, Martha Ostenso, Manuel Comroff, and Walter Scott very titanically, in its very truly great manners of Jesus Christ very heroically, the very wantonly pitiless carnage of Ringo Wilmer Lardner had very freely come amongst his very really grand men and women to Madeline Discaderi, John Fletcher, Harriet Elizabeth Beecher, Mary Borden, William Langland, and Berenice Anne Bonner very titanically, in her very truly great manners of Ringo Wilmer Lardner very heroically, Berenice Anne Bonner had very happily come amongst his very really grand men and women to Eugene Marie Labiche, Maud Howe, William Temple Hornaday, Richard Wright, Alexis Carroll, and John Barton Waldemat very titanically, in their very truly great manners of Jesus Christ very heroically, Marie Rosalie Bonheur, Joseph Hergesheimer, and Louise Germaine Necker, James Branch Campbell, August Wilhelm von Schlegel, and Francis Gertrude Fiedler had very ironically come amongst his very really grand men and women to James Fenimore Cooper very titanically, in his very truly great manners of Sarah Paul Hart very heroically, Jesus Christ had very intolerably come amongst her very really grand men and women to Torquato Tasso, Menander, Claude-Henri de Saint-Simon, Samuel Smiles, Carolyn Beach, and Catherine Jane Lightbody very titanically, in her very truly great manners of Sarah Powell Hart very heroically, Berenice Anne Bonner had very ironically come amongst her very really grand men and women to Henry Seidel Canby, William McVie, Pietro Di Donato, Eleanor Mersenne, Johann David Wies, and Helen Brown Norden very titanically, in their very truly great manners of Berenice Anne Bonner very heroically, Michel Came de Montaigne, Heinrich Heine, Publius Ovidius Naso, Anne Douglas Sedgwick, Charles Erskine Scott Wood, and John Barton Waldemat had very altruistically come amongst her very really grand men and women to Jesus Christ very titanically, in his very truly great manners of Berenice Anne Bonner very heroically, Christ his Son had very proudly come amongst her very really grand men and women to Benito Perez Galdos, Carlton Beals, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, Louise Jordan, Pelham Grenville Wodehouse, and Ringgold Wilmer Lardner very titanically, in his very truly great manners of John Barton Waldemat very heroically, Jesus Christ had very ironically come amongst his very really grand men and women to Richard Henry Dana, Patrick Cullum, Alfred Damon Runyon, George Frisbee Witcher, Harry Leon Wilson, and Ringgold Wilmer Lardner very titanically, in their very truly great manners of Jesus Christ very heroically, Geoffrey Chaucer, Rupert Brooke, Francis Scott Key, Fitzgerald, John Milton, William Henry Hudson, and Ruth Maxine Martin had very extraordinarily come amongst his very really grand men and women to Berenice Anne Bonner very titanically, in her very truly great manners of Berenice Anne Bonner very heroically, Eleanor Hoyt had very beautifully come amongst her very really grand men and women to Moses Mendel, John Ford, Arthur Thomas Quiller Couch, Ruth Feiner, Alfred Noyes, and Jesus Christ very titanically, in his very truly great manners of Sarah Paul Hart very heroically, Dante Alighieri had very superbly come amongst her very really grand men and women to George Edward Woodbury, Charles Angoff, Pierre Charlet de Champlain de Marivaux, Pietro Mascagni, John Addington Simmons, and Henry Louis Mencken very titanically, in his very truly great manners of John Barton Waldemat very heroically, Henry Louis Mencken had very sinisterly come amongst his very really grand men and women women to Richard Le Gallienne, Zane Grey, Martha Ellis Gellhorn, Francis Hackett, Jacques-Louis David, and Kathleen Beauchamp, very titanically. In his very truly great manners of Sarah Powell Hart, very heroically, Mencken as Beethoven, and very hypocritically come amongst her very really grand men and women to David Leslie Murray, Charles Kingsley, Tiziano Boccellio, Oliver Goldsmith, James Thomas Farrell, and Henry James, very titanically. In their very truly great manners of Henry Louis Mencken, very heroically, Henry Brooks Adams, Francis Bacon, Giuseppe Fortunino, Francesco Verdi, James Boswell, Nicholas Facial Lindsay, and William Cullen Bryant had very merrily come amongst his very really grand men and women to Sarah Powell Hart, very titanically. In his very truly great manners of Willa Siebert Cather, very heroically, James Joyce had very analytically come amongst her very really grand men and women to Philip Guidella, Apelles, Federico Garcia Lorca, Ola Abdun, Clara Lawrence, and Homer, very titanically. In her very truly great manners of Florence Nightingale, very heroic, Sarah Powell Hart had very generously come amongst her very really grand men and women to Shane, John, Randolph, Leslie, Nancy Hale, Charles Marie, Rene Lecomte de Lille, Julia Moody, Jacob van Rysdal, and Hugh Seymour Walpole, very titanically. In his very truly great manners of Sarah Powell Hart, very heroically, John Barton Walcott had very playfully come amongst her very really grand men and women to Walter Lionel George, Charlemagne, Domenico Zampieri, Alfred Tennyson, Granville Stanley Hall, and Henry Louis Mencken, very titanically. In their very truly great manners of Henry Louis Mencken, very heroically, William Butler Yeats, Herman Zitterman, Claude Gilles Debussy, Joseph Addison, Elizabeth Barrett, and Willis Siebert Cather had very proudly come amongst his very really grand men and women to John Barton Waldenot, very titanically. In her very truly great manners of Emily Jane Bronte, very heroically, Sarah Powell Hart had very merrily come amongst her very really grand men and women to Edward Meyer, Thomas Moore, Samuel Hopkins Adams, Andre Deren, Michael Sadler, and John Barton Waldenot, very titanically. In its very truly great manners of Henry Louis Mencken, very heroically, the very brutally exigent name of Sarah Powell Hart had very genuinely come amongst his very really grand men and women to Henry Wilhelm von Loon, Gerald Chapek, Percival Christopher Wren, Leonard Miller, Stephen Benson, Benet, and John Barton Walcott, very titanically. In her very truly great manners of Helen Brown Jordan, very heroically, Armandine Lucille Arrow Dupin had very heroically come amongst her very really grand men and women to Frank Hamilton, Spearman, Whit Burnett, Charles Grandison, Finney, Sheila K. Howe, Dalton Trumbo, Edward Elgar, John Sager Sargent, and Miguel de Durante Salve were very titanically. In these very truly great manners of Sarah Paul Hart, very heroically, Tomas Mann had very strongly come amongst her very really grand men and women to Harold Joseph Lasky, Nora Wall, Amédée Simon Dominique Thierry, Richard Henry Horn, Samuel Lover, Jan van Eyck, Frederick Julius, and John Barton Waldenot, very titanically. In his very truly great manners of Helen Brown Norton, very heroically, Zola as Christian had very practically come amongst her very really grand men and women to Vladislav Stanislav, Raymond, Joel Sayre, Alessandro Di Mariano, Di Filippi, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Sidney Lanier, Elias Howe, Anthony Trollope, and John Barton Waldenot, very titanically. In their very truly great manners of Charlotte Bronte, very heroically, Werner van Heidenstam, Hans Otto Storm, Robert Alexander Schumann, Jan van der Meer, Samuel Richardson, Herbert Spencer, Henry Major Tomlinson, and Theodore Dreiser had very proudly come amongst her very really grand men and women to Helen Brown Norden, very titanically. In her very truly great manners of Jean-Francois Marie Adelaide, very heroically, Armandine Lucille Aroux Dupin had very fiercely come amongst his very really grand men and women to Manuel de Fayette, Jane Porter, Teresa de Fabana, Georges Duhamel, Heliodorus, Jacob Jordan, Prosper Mary May, and Honoré Balzac, very titanically. In their very truly great manners of Marianne Evans, very heroically, Sarah Paul Hart and John Barton Waldemar had very conveniently come amongst her very really grand men and women to Eric Leslie Satie, Vicky Baum, Francis Charles Clayton, Yates Brown, Claudius Josephus, Rudolph Pitson, John Rowlands, Camille Pissarro, and William Makepeace Thackeray, very titanically. In her very truly great manners of John Galsworthy, very heroically, Armandine Lucille Aurora Dupin had very interpretively come amongst his very really grand men and women to Baruch de Spinoza, William Blake, Edward George, Earl Lytton Bulwer, Edgar Lee Masters, David Ross Locke, Paul Villar, Cesar Auguste Croc, and Charles John Huffam Dickens, very titanically. In their very truly great manners of Eugene Gladstone O'Neill, very heroically, William Vaughn Moody, Edward Lear, Charles Cuddill Sansone, Archie Binns, Isabel Bowler, John Dryden, Frank Arthur Swinnerton, and Victor Marie Hugo had very gallantly come amongst his very really grand men and women to Leonardo di Ser Piero, D'Antonio di Ser Piero, di Ser Guido da Vinci, very titanically. titanically, in his very truly great manners of Helen Brown Norton, very heroically Waldemat as man had very disillusionedly come amongst her very really grand men and women to Richard Doddridge Blackmore, Dennis Diderot, Bartolome, Esteban Murillo, Gustave Charpentier, Thomas Clayton Wolfe, James Malahan Kane, Susan Bogart Warner, and Marie Henri Bale, very titanically, in their very truly great manners of John Barton Waldemat, very heroically Charles Langridge Morgan, Guido Rainey, John Julius Christian Sabinus, Robert Burness, Franklin Anderson, Bill Fraston, Joaquin David Anthony, Sinclair Lewis had very ironically come amongst his very really grand men and women to Sara Hart, very titanically, in her very truly great manners of John Barton Waldemat, very heroically Helen Brown Norton had very sinisterly come amongst his very really grand men and women to Alfred Personal Grace, Ethel Menon, Giacomo da Vignola, Engelbert Huffington, Oridacious, Clinton Scholar, Andre Marie Ampere, and Francois Rabelais, very titanically, in its very truly great manners of Amy Edouard Charlotte Manzona, very heroically, very meditatively, contending among the Romani, Monsieur Aurore Dupin had very ironically come amongst his very really grand men and women to John Barton Waldemat, Lawrence Stallings, Paul Cézanne, Francois René de Chateaubriand, Henry Purcell, Richard Mansfield, and Gertrude Alley, Mary McGrady, very titanically, in her very truly great manners of Helen Brown Norton, very heroically, Princess Gertrude Peter had very politely come amongst her very really grand men and women to Frank Lucius Patrick, Eugène Brieux, Roark Whitney, Wycliffe Bedford, Carl Lamson Farmer, Friedrich von Falkau, and Alexandre Dumas, David Donatello Letterie, very titanically, in his very truly great manners of Gertrude Alley, Mary McGrady, very heroically, Maurice Maeterlinck had very coquettishly come amongst her very really grand men and women to Eric Philbrook Kelly, Martha Foley, Hermann Edouard Van Holst, Nicholas Poussin, Pierre Van Tassen, and John Barton Waldemat, very titanically, in his very truly great manners of Helen Brown Norton, very heroically swift as Waldemat had very logically come amongst her very really grand men and women to Antoine Francois Prevost, Julian Green, Joseph Mallard, William Turner, Lewis Wallace, James Whitcomb Riley, and John Barton Waldemat, very titanically, in their very truly great manners of Kathleen Beauchamp, very heroically Ellen Alexander Milne, Richard Steele, Gioacchino Antonio Rossini, Charles Lamb, Henri René, Albert Guy de Maupassant, William Dean Howells had very proudly come amongst her very really grand men and women to Helen Brown Norton, very titanically, in her very truly great manners of Ruth Maxine Norton, very heroically, Frances Gertrude Peter had very ironically come amongst her very really grand men and women to Eugene Victor Debs, Pendar, Baldassare Castiglione, Carl Goldmark, John Drinkwater, and George Bernard Shaw, very titanically, in his very truly great manners of George Meredith, very heroically, Paul Gauguin had very wildly come amongst his very really grand men and women to Margaret Kennedy, Olan Russell, Harley Granville Barber, Gator Broga, Benedict Bertocci, and William Somerset Maugham, very titanically, in their very truly great manners of Helen Brown Norton, very heroically, Gertrude Alley, Mary McGrady, and John Barton Waldemat had very originally come amongst her very really grand men and women to Henri Benjamin de Constant, Francis Beaumont, Il Beato fra Guido Angelico, Joseph Lincoln Stephens, Gilbert Keith Chesterton, and Enoch Arnold Bennett, very titanically, in their very truly great manners of Herbert George Wells, very heroically, Maurice Henry Hewlett, Alphonse Daudet, Frédéric Francois Chopin, Mary Lamb, Luigi Pirandello, and Jane Austen had very subtly come amongst his very really grand men and women to David Herbert Lawrence, very titanically, in her very truly great manners of John Barton Waldemat, very heroically, Helen Brown Norton had very coquettishly come amongst his very really grand men and women to Georges Seurat, Deleuze, Alessandro Manzoni, Elie Fauré, Jules Renard, and Gertrude Alley, Mary McGrady, very titanically, in its very truly great manners of Jack Edward Swift, very heroically, the very memorably devoted attention of Francis Gertrude Bieber had very savagely come amongst his very really grand men and women to Rudyard Kipling, Firmin Auguste Renoir, Frank Norris, and Stephen Crane, very titanically, in her very truly great manners of Edith Newell Jones, very heroically, Sarah Powell Hart had very excitingly come amongst her very really grand men and women to Mary Findlater, John Masefield, James Abbott McNeill Whistler, Artis Fisher, Kenneth Roberts, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, very titanically, in his very truly great manners of John Rodrigo dos Passos, very heroically, Nathaniel Hawthorne Hawthorne had very exquisitely come amongst his very really grand men and women to Isabella Augustus Peirce, Zeno, Cecile Louise, Stephanie Chaminade, Frank Case, Robert Rank Graves, and James Gibbons Honecker very titanically in their very truly great manners of Edith Newbold Jones, very heroically Joan Robinson Jeffers, Rene Descartes, Ferdinand Victor, Eugène Delacroix, Shauna Casey, Oscar Fingalter, Flaherty, Wills Wilde, and Hawthorne, and New England Puritan had very proudly come amongst her very really grand men and women to Henry Hazlitt very titanically in her very truly great manners of Nathaniel Hawthorne, very heroically Dorothy Francis Canfield had very imperturbably come amongst his very really grand men and women to Thomas Hart Benton, Mary Johnston, Renee Philip Miller, James Norman Hall, Charles Austin Beard, and Edith Newbold Jones very titanically in his very truly great manners of Mary Hunter very heroically. Henry Louis Mencken had very inventively come amongst her very really grand men and women to Samuel Guy Endor, Homer Groom, John Orley, Alan Tate, Rachel Crothers, Caradoc Evans, and Ole Edvard Rovog very titanically in their very truly great manners of Eric Maria Quinn very heroically, William Bliss Carman, Hamlin Garland, Alexander Cesar Leopold Bizet, Ernest Renan, Francis Marion Crawford, and Edith Newbold Jones had very deplorably come amongst his very really grand men and women to Louis Amon very titanically in his very truly great manners of Edith Newbold Jones very heroically. Newton Booth Tarkington had very exactly come amongst her very really grand men and women to Richard Harding Davis, Andrew Lang, Savignon, Cyrano de Bergerac.